I woke up with a start, my heart pounding as I stared at the corrugated metal ceiling of my quarters. The same nightmare again, trapped under the ice, pounding at a frozen ceiling that wouldn't break. I fumbled for my watch on the nightstand, squinting at the glowing face. 3 a.m. again. This made it the 5th night in a row I'd woken at exactly the same time. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, knowing from experience that falling back asleep was a lost cause. The insomnia had been getting worse over the past few weeks. At first I blamed it on the perpetual darkness of the Siberian winter, but now I wasn't so sure. Everyone at drilling site Omega-7 was feeling it. The isolation, the pressure from headquarters, the way time seemed to blur when you never saw the sun. My name is Theodore Garrison, but everyone calls me Theo. I'm 48 years old, born in 1946, been working oil and gas for over 22 years, and this Siberian job was supposed to be my ticket to senior management. The project bonus alone would cover the remaining $180,000 on our mortgage in Houston, maybe even handle Lisa's $15,000 annual tuition at TCU. My wife, Luella, we'd married young when I was 22 and she was 20, had been understanding about the 6-month rotation, but I knew she was counting the days until I came home. Lisa was 20 now, a junior at Texas Christian University, studying environmental science. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was drilling for oil in Siberia to pay for my daughter's education about protecting the environment. Tommy, our 15-year-old, was already talking about following his sister to college. At my salary of $85,000 plus project bonuses, I could handle 1 kid in college, but 2 would stretch us thin. This Siberian contract was my chance to get ahead of the curve. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and reached for my thermal layers. The room was freezing despite the heating system's constant hum. That was life at a Siberian drilling operation in 1994. You were never truly warm, just varying degrees of cold. The post-Soviet chaos had made everything more complicated. Permits that meant nothing, local officials who disappeared overnight, and infrastructure that barely functioned. After pulling on my clothes, I shuffled down the narrow hallway toward the operations center. I figured I might as well get some coffee and review the seismic data if I couldn't sleep. The facility was eerily quiet at this hour, just the occasional creak of metal contracting in the cold and the distant rumble of generators that burned through diesel fuel faster than we could truck it in from Novosibirsk. I wasn't expecting anyone else to be up, which is why I was surprised to see the lights on in the operations room. Walt Patterson sat hunched over his laptop, one of those new compact models that weighed 10 pounds and cost more than my monthly salary. He was surrounded by stacks of papers and empty coffee mugs, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with desperate intensity. "You're up early, Garrison," he said, without looking up. "Could say the same about you," I replied, heading for the coffee maker. The machine was one of those industrial models that could brew enough for 30 men, though our team was only 5 strong. "Have you even been to bed?" Walt finally looked up, and I noticed the dark circles under his eyes. At 52, he looked every bit his age tonight, maybe older. The divorce proceedings back in Denver weren't helping his stress levels, and the corporate pressure from Houston was eating him alive. "Too much work to do," he said, gesturing at his laptop screen. "Houston's breathing down my neck about the quarterly projections. We're behind schedule, and the board's getting nervous about the investment." I poured myself a cup of coffee, not bothering to point out that we were actually ahead of our drilling timeline. Walt had been pushing everyone harder lately, extending shifts and demanding more core samples. The accountants back in Houston were questioning every line item, and Walt was feeling the heat. The oil industry in 1994 was cutthroat, especially for smaller independent companies like ours trying to compete with the majors. "I need you to take seismic readings today," Walt said, sliding a geological survey map across the table. "From this area here." He pointed to a section marked in red ink. I looked at the map and frowned. That was almost 3 miles farther out than our usual survey zone, well beyond the parameters of our original drilling plan. "Exactly," Walt said, reading my expression. "We need fresh data, untouched ground. The geological surveys are showing some interesting anomalies that could indicate a much larger oil field than we initially thought." His tone made it clear this wasn't up for debate. I nodded and took another sip of coffee. There was no point arguing with Walt when he got like this. Better to just do what he asked and get it over with. Besides, I needed this job more than he needed me. At 48, switching companies wasn't as easy as it used to be, and the industry was already starting to feel overcrowded with younger engineers fresh out of college. The others will join you later, he added. I want them to finish processing yesterday's core samples first. Houston wants a full geological report by Friday, and if we don't deliver, they're threatening to pull funding. That caught my attention. If Houston pulled funding, we'd all be on the next plane home, and my hopes of making senior management would go with it. The thought of facing Luella and telling her that not only was there no bonus, but I might be looking for work again, made my stomach churn. Fine by me, I said, though the prospect of spending the day alone on the frozen tundra wasn't particularly appealing. Some alone time out on the tundra actually sounded good. Anything to get away from the claustrophobic confines of the facility and the constant worry about corporate politics. I've been in this business long enough to know that when headquarters started asking questions, heads usually rolled. And with my age and the mortgage payments, I couldn't afford to be one of them. 6 hours later, I was trudging across the frozen landscape, my breath forming clouds in front of my face. The temperature gauge on my parka read 31 degree Haas, but the wind made it feel like 50 deeks. I've been taking seismic readings for the past 2 hours, carefully placing sensors and recording data that would help us map the geological structure thousands of feet below. The work was methodical, almost meditative, a welcome break from thinking about the kids' college expenses and whether this project would actually pan out. The satellite phone in my pack had been buzzing intermittently all morning, probably Luella trying to reach me during her lunch break in Houston. The time difference made communication tricky, but I'd promised to call her every few days. She worried about me out here in the middle of nowhere, especially after that incident in Alaska 3 years ago when a rig worker had fallen through ice and died. The oil business was dangerous enough without adding the complications of working in a post-Soviet wasteland where safety regulations were more suggestion than law. I was about to start on my final measurement site when something caught my eye, a patch of color against the endless white. I blinked, thinking it might be a trick of the light, or maybe equipment left behind by one of the Russian crews. But it was still there when I looked again. Something green. I walked closer, my boots crunching in the snow. The sound echoed across the empty landscape, reminding me just how isolated we were. The nearest town was over 100 miles away, and even that was barely more than a collection of abandoned Soviet-era buildings and a few hardy locals trying to scratch out a living. As I approached, I realized what I was seeing, though my brain refused to accept it. It was grass. Actual green grass growing in a small patch amid the Siberian snow, as impossible as finding palm trees in Alaska. What the hell, I muttered, kneeling down beside it. This was impossible. Nothing grew out here, especially not in the middle of winter. The permafrost was supposed to be solid for hundreds of feet down, frozen harder than concrete. I've been working in extreme climates for over 2 decades, from the north slope of Alaska to the North Sea, and I'd never seen anything like this. I reached out and touched it with my gloved hand. It was real, not some hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and too much coffee. The grass felt normal, healthy even, as if it was growing in a temperate climate instead of one of the harshest environments on Earth. I pulled out my satellite phone, grateful that the company had finally started issuing them to all senior personnel after that incident in Nigeria, where they'd lost contact with the drilling team for 3 days. The technology was still new. The phone was the size of a briefcase and cost more than a car, but it beat the alternative of being completely cut off. "Base, this is Garrison. I found something unusual." Walt's voice crackled back almost immediately, distorted by static. "Define unusual." "There's grass growing out here, green grass in the middle of the permafrost." There was a long pause before Walt responded. I could hear typing in the background and what sounded like another voice, probably Rebecca or Luella reviewing data. Exact coordinates. I read off my GPS location from the handheld unit we'd been issued. The global positioning system was another new technology, just released for civilian use, though the military had been using it for years. It still seemed like science fiction to be able to pinpoint your location anywhere on Earth to within a few feet. "Stay there," Walt ordered. "Don't touch anything else. We're coming to you." The urgency in his voice surprised me. Walt wasn't the type to get excited about botanical anomalies, especially when he had corporate pressure breathing down his neck. But maybe this was exactly what we needed, some kind of geothermal activity that could indicate oil deposits below. I sat back on my heels, staring at the impossible patch of grass while my mind raced through possible explanations. Geothermal vents could create localized warming, but we would have detected that in our initial surveys. Underground hot springs were possible, but again, our equipment should have picked up the thermal signature. Curious, I brushed away some of the snow surrounding the grass, using my gloved hands to clear a wider area. That's when I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. The ground beneath the grass wasn't soil or rock. It was metal. I cleared away more snow with renewed urgency, my hands working faster despite the cold. What I revealed made me forget all about seismic readings and corporate pressure and even the mortgage back home. It was a large metal panel, or door, partially buried in the permafrost, heavily weathered by decades of Siberian winters, but unmistakably man-made. The grass was growing from a small seam where the metal had corroded, as if something beneath was providing heat and moisture. Something that had been down there for a very long time. By the time I heard the snowmobiles approaching, I'd cleared enough snow to reveal what looked like an old hatch or door, at least 8 feet in diameter. It was made of some kind of steel alloy, though heavily weathered by time and the elements. The metal had a distinctive greenish patina that reminded me of old Soviet industrial equipment I'd seen in other former Eastern Bloc countries. Walt arrived first, followed closely by Dr. Rebecca Morgan, Luella Bennett, and Dmitry Kozlov. Rebecca was our environmental specialist, a sharp 44-year-old single mother who'd been working cleanup sites since the Exxon Valdez spill. Luella Bennett was our geological surveyor, fresh out of Colorado School of Mines with more enthusiasm than field experience. Dmitry was the opposite, a 46-year-old Serbian geologist who'd been working Soviet-era sites since before the wall came down. They all stared in disbelief at my discovery, their faces a mixture of scientific curiosity and professional concern. In our business, unexpected discoveries usually meant delays, and delays meant cost overruns that corporate didn't appreciate. "How is this possible?" Rebecca asked, kneeling beside me to examine the grass. Her breath formed clouds as she spoke, and I could see her environmental monitoring equipment recording data automatically. She'd learned to document everything after too many corporate lawyers had questioned her findings on previous projects. "More importantly, what is this?" Luella added, gesturing to the metal door I'd uncovered. Her voice carried the excitement of someone who'd only read about discoveries like this in textbooks. Walt pushed past both of them, his expression intense in a way that made me uncomfortable. I'd seen that look before, usually right before he made decisions that put profit over safety. "It's man-made, obviously," he said, brushing away more snow with his gloved hands. "There are markings here." We all leaned in to look. Sure enough, there was faded lettering stamped into the metal. Most of it was too corroded to read, but I could make out what looked like Cyrillic characters and a date, 1963. "This has been here for 31 years, I said, running my fingers over the numbers. "Since before any of us were working in this industry?" Dmitry, who had been circling the perimeter of our discovery, called out in his thick accent. "The metal extends further. I think this is entrance to bunker or facility. Soviet construction, definitely military or research." Walt stood up, his eyes gleaming with an excitement I hadn't seen before. In the oil business, finding unexpected infrastructure could mean several things. Archaeological significance that would shut down operations, environmental hazards that would trigger investigations, or, if you were lucky, existing facilities that could be repurposed to support drilling operations. "We need to open it," he said. "Wait," Luella said, adjusting her equipment nervously. She was young enough to still follow protocols religiously. "Shouldn't we report this first? Follow proper procedures with the Russian authorities?" Walt scoffed. "Report to who? Half the local government officials have disappeared since '91, and the other half are too busy trying to figure out who's supposed to be in charge to care about a 30-year-old hole in the ground." He had a point. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left a bureaucratic nightmare in its wake. Environmental permits that had taken months to secure could become worthless overnight when the issuing agency simply ceased to exist. I'd seen drilling. Operations in Kazakhstan get shut down because 3 different government bodies claimed jurisdiction over the same piece of land. Besides, Walt continued, his voice taking on the tone he used when trying to convince Houston that budget overruns were justified, this could be exactly what we need. If it's some kind of research facility, there might be geological surveys, maps, data that could save us months of exploration time. I wasn't entirely convinced by Walt's logic, but I couldn't deny my own curiosity. What was a Soviet facility doing out here in the middle of nowhere? And more importantly, what would this mean for our drilling operation? Corporate was already questioning our timeline and budget. If this discovery could actually help us rather than hinder us, it might be the break we needed. "We have equipment on the snowmobiles," Rebecca said pragmatically. Shovels, picks, the portable thermal cutter we brought for ice removal. She was thinking like an engineer, which I appreciated. If we were going to do this, we might as well do it right. Walt nodded decisively. Get everything. Garrison, help me clear more of this snow. For the next hour, we worked to uncover the full extent of the metal door. It was circular, about 8 feet in diameter, with what appeared to be a manual locking mechanism in the center. The whole thing was sealed tight, frozen shut by 3 decades of Siberian ice. As we worked, I found myself thinking about the timing. 1963 was right in the middle of the Cold War, when both superpowers were building secret facilities in remote locations. The thermal cutter should melt through the ice around the edges, Rebecca suggested, already setting up the equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of work before. Luella still looked uncomfortable, checking her watch nervously. I really think we should wait. What if there's some kind of environmental contamination down there? Then we document it and report it, Walt cut her off. But we're not walking away from the biggest discovery this operation has made without at least taking a look. We took turns with the thermal cutter, carefully melting the ice that had formed around the edges of the door. The work was slow and methodical, but eventually we cleared enough that we could attempt to open it. The cutter itself was a piece of equipment that would have been impossible to get just a few years earlier. German engineering that had become available after reunification, when Western companies started selling to anyone with hard currency. It's going to need leverage, Dmitri said, examining the locking mechanism with the practiced eye of someone who'd dealt with Soviet industrial equipment before. It's frozen solid, but mechanism looks intact. Walt nodded and turned to me. Garrison, get the pry bars from the equipment sled. I fetched the tools, heavy steel bars that we normally used for breaking through ice layers during core sampling. Dmitri and I positioned them at opposite sides of the hatch while the others stood back. The wind had picked up, and I could feel the temperature dropping even further. We needed to get this done before the weather turned completely against us. On 3, Walt counted down. 1, 2, 3. We both pulled with all our strength. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, the ice around the seal cracked and the door shifted slightly. A metallic groan echoed across the tundra as metal that had been frozen solid for 3 decades finally began to move. Again, Walt ordered. We repositioned and pulled again. This time, the door gave way with a loud protest of hinges that hadn't moved since the Kennedy administration. Stale air rushed out, carrying with it a musty smell of age and abandonment, mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. It reminded me of the time I'd explored an abandoned mine shaft in Colorado, that same sense of disturbed time. Walt immediately shined his flashlight into the opening, revealing a set of metal stairs descending into darkness. The beam couldn't reach the bottom, and the stairs seemed to spiral down much farther than I would have expected for any kind of surface facility. My God, Luella whispered, her earlier concerns temporarily forgotten in the face of discovery. It's some kind of underground complex. Soviet era, definitely, Rebecca added, taking readings with her environmental equipment. The construction style, the materials, this is military-grade engineering from the 1960s. Dmitri moved closer to the opening, peering down into the darkness. During Cold War, Soviets built many secret facilities in remote locations. Research stations, military bunkers, monitoring posts. Most were abandoned after 91, but some... He shrugged in that way that suggested there were stories he didn't want to tell. Walt was already preparing to descend, checking his flashlight and adjusting his equipment pack. The excitement in his movements was almost manic, and I found myself thinking about the corporate pressure he'd been under. A discovery like this could either save his career or destroy it, depending on how corporate chose to spin it. This changes everything, he said, his breath visible in the cold air. Whatever research was conducted here could be invaluable, could provide geological data that saves us months of survey work. I peered down into the darkness, feeling a strange sense of unease that had nothing to do with the cold. The staircase seemed to go down much farther than I would have expected for a Siberian research bunker. And there was something about the air coming from below. It didn't feel as cold as it should have after being sealed for 3 decades. We should proceed with caution, I said, my 22 years of experience in dangerous environments making me naturally conservative. We don't know what kind of conditions are down there, or what they were, researching. But Walt was already starting down the stairs, his flashlight beam bouncing off metal walls. The beam revealed institutional paint, that particular shade of green that seemed to be universal to government facilities worldwide. "Bring the equipment," he called back, his voice already echoing strangely in the confined space. "And someone grab those sample containers. If there's geological data down there, we're going to document every bit of it." One by one, we followed him down, our footsteps echoing metallically in the narrow stairwell. I went second, followed by Rebecca, then Luella, with Dimitri bringing up the rear. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling down into the permafrost in a way that suggested serious engineering and significant investment. I counted at least 60 steps before we finally reached the bottom, which put us roughly 90 feet underground, deeper than many mining operations I'd worked on. The air down here was warmer than the surface, probably close to freezing instead of the 30-degree we'd left behind. Walt's flashlight revealed a long corridor stretching ahead, with several doors leading off to either side. The walls were made of concrete, painted in that same institutional green, now faded and peeling in places. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, but the construction looked remarkably solid for something that had been abandoned for over 30 years. "What is this place?" Rebecca whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Her environmental equipment was clicking steadily, recording data that might be crucial if we discovered any kind of contamination. None of us had an answer. We stood at the threshold of the underground facility, our flashlights illuminating just enough to show us that we'd stumbled onto something much bigger than any of us had anticipated. Something that could either be the discovery of our careers or the beginning of a nightmare that would make our corporate problems seem insignificant. I followed Walt down the metal staircase, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls as we descended deeper into the darkness. The air grew warmer and staler with each step, carrying that unmistakable musty smell of a space that hadn't been opened in decades. It reminded me of the basement of my grandfather's house in Oklahoma, where old photographs and forgotten memories gathered dust in cardboard boxes. "Watch your step," Walt called back, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow stairwell. "These stairs might not be structurally sound after all this time." The rest of our team followed behind me, Rebecca with her environmental monitoring equipment constantly beeping, Luella documenting everything with her digital camera, and Dimitri muttering observations in Serbian under his breath. None of us had expected to find anything like this beneath the Siberian permafrost, let alone what appeared to be a fully constructed underground research complex. When we reached the bottom, our flashlights revealed a long corridor with several doors on both sides. The concrete walls were painted in that institutional green that seemed universal to government facilities from the Cold War era, the same color I'd seen in decommissioned military bases across 3 continents. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, but the construction looked remarkably intact for something that had been sealed for over 3 decades. "Let's check these rooms," Walt said, already moving toward the first door on the right. His excitement was palpable, and I recognized the gleam in his eyes. It was the same look he got when quarterly reports showed above-target production numbers. The first room we entered contained old computer equipment that belonged in a museum. Massive units took up entire walls, with reel-to-reel tape drives and control panels covered in switches and dials labeled in Cyrillic script. Everything looked like it had been built in the early 1960s, when computers were room-sized behemoths that required teams of operators. "Cold War-era technology," Luella said, adjusting her camera settings as she documented the equipment. "This must have been some kind of data processing center. Look at the size of these units." Rebecca was taking air quality readings, her equipment showing slightly elevated temperature and humidity levels that didn't make sense for a sealed underground facility. "Something's not right here," she murmured, checking her instruments again. But it was the walls that caught my attention. Between the massive computer units hung paintings, not the standard government-issue artwork you'd expect in a military installation, but disturbing, almost primitive-looking landscapes that seemed out of place in a research facility. I moved closer to examine one, my flashlight beam revealing details that made my skin crawl. "These are strange," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The painting showed what looked like the Siberian tundra, but something was fundamentally wrong with it. The permafrost appeared to be melting or dissolving, revealing dark soil underneath that seemed to move and writhe in the painted landscape. The artist had used a technique that created an unsettling optical illusion, making the ground appear to be alive, breathing. "There's more in here," Rebecca called from another room across the hall, her voice carrying a note of concern that made us all look up. We followed her voice and found ourselves in what appeared to be a conference room with a long table and metal chairs that looked like they hadn't been moved in decades. More paintings hung on these walls, but these were even more disturbing than the first set. They showed the same landscape progression, starting with pristine Arctic scenes that could have been beautiful if not for the underlying sense of wrongness in the composition. Then the paintings gradually showed decay and change, the white snow giving way to dark organic growth that spread across the landscape like some kind of infection. The final painting in the sequence made me step back involuntarily. It depicted bizarre humanoid figures emerging from the ice, their forms elongated and wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. They weren't quite human, too tall and thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in impossible directions, and faces that the artist had deliberately obscured, as if even depicting them clearly was dangerous. "What the hell were they doing down here?" I muttered, studying the figures more closely, while trying not to look directly at their obscured features. The painting technique was crude but effective, creating a sense of movement and malevolence that made the conference room feel suddenly claustrophobic. "We need to keep moving," Walt said, already heading back to the corridor. His voice carried a forced enthusiasm that didn't quite mask an underlying nervousness. "There must be more rooms, maybe offices with records or research data." We continued down the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, with more doors leading off in both directions. Some were locked, their handles frozen solid, but others opened easily to reveal empty rooms or storage areas filled with equipment we couldn't identify. The paintings continued throughout the facility, each room containing more disturbing artwork that seemed to document some kind of progressive transformation or infection. The artistic style was consistent but crude, as if whoever had painted them was more concerned with recording events than creating aesthetically pleasing artwork. "This doesn't feel like a normal research facility," Luella said quietly as we passed another room filled with the unsettling paintings. "It feels more like documentation, like they were recording something that was happening, not something they were studying." Her words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the underground temperature, because I was beginning to think she was right. The corridor eventually opened into a large central chamber that took my breath away. This room was clearly the heart of the facility, a circular space with a high domed ceiling and doorways leading off in 6 different directions, like spokes on a wheel. The architecture was impressive, suggesting this had been a major installation rather than just a monitoring post. But it was what stood in the center of the room that made us all stop in our tracks. A massive machine dominated the space, unlike anything I'd ever seen in over 2 decades of industrial work. It resembled a generator or a power plant of some kind, but with components that seemed almost organic in their curves and connections. Pipes and cables ran from its base into the floor and walls, creating a web of connections that suggested it was integral to the facility's operation. The most shocking thing wasn't its strange design, but the fact that it was still running. Several gauges on its control panel were moving, dials twitching slightly as if responding to some internal process. A soft humming sound emanated from within the machine, barely audible but constant, like the heartbeat of some sleeping giant. Indicator lights blinked in slow, hypnotic patterns across panels covered in Cyrillic labels and warning symbols. "This is impossible," Luella said, voicing what we were all thinking. Her camera clicked rapidly as she documented everything, the flash illuminating details that our flashlights couldn't reach. "There's no way this should still be operational after 31 years of abandonment." Walt approached the machine with the fascination of an engineer encountering technology beyond his understanding. The soft glow from its panels illuminated his face, making his expression almost reverent. "This is extraordinary," he breathed, studying the control panels. "Some kind of self-sustaining power source. Look at these readings. It's not just running, it's been running continuously for decades." Rebecca was taking environmental measurements near the machine's base, her equipment registering readings that made her frown with concern. "Temperature's elevated here, and I'm getting unusual electromagnetic signatures. Whatever this thing is powered by, it's not conventional." While they examined the machine, I noticed something disturbing on the floor near its base. At first, I thought it was just condensation, or some kind of coolant leak. But when I crouched down for a closer look, I realized it was something far more unsettling. An organic substance covered the floor around the machine in a thin film that glistened in my flashlight beam. It looked almost like moss or algae, but it seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, responding to the machine's humming with subtle movements that made my stomach turn. "Walt," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to see this." He came over and knelt beside me, his excitement overriding any sense of caution. Fascinating. Some kind of biofilm, maybe bacterial growth responding to the machine's energy output. I wasn't convinced it was that simple. I've never seen bacterial growth like this before. I pointed my light toward the walls where the same substance appeared to be climbing upward in delicate web-like patterns. And look how it's spreading in organized patterns. The growth wasn't random. It followed the pipes and cables connected to the machine, creating an organic network that paralleled the mechanical one. It was almost as if the machine and the biological growth were working together, two parts of a larger system. Walt stood up, brushing off his hands with the casual dismissal of someone focused on bigger pictures. "We need to document everything. This facility could be the discovery that changes our entire understanding of Soviet research capabilities." He turned to address all of us, his corporate instincts taking over. "We should split up to cover more ground efficiently. For safety, we'll go in pairs." He pointed to the doorways leading off from the central chamber. "Garrison, you and Rebecca take the eastern section. Dmitri and Luella, you investigate the western rooms. I'll stay here and study this machine further." I wasn't thrilled about splitting up, especially given the disturbing nature of what we'd already found. But Walt's tone made it clear this wasn't up for debate. In corporate hierarchies, project managers made decisions, and field personnel followed them, regardless of personal misgivings. Rebecca and I headed toward the eastern doorway, our flashlights creating long shadows ahead of us. The air in this direction felt different, warmer and more humid, with that same organic smell I'd noticed around the machine's base. "I don't like this place," Rebecca said quietly, as we entered what appeared to be a residential area with several sleeping quarters. "My equipment's picking up readings that don't make sense for an abandoned facility." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The whole complex had an oppressive atmosphere that went beyond just being underground and abandoned. There was something alive about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Let's just document what we find and get back to the others," I said. Though part of me was already thinking about the satellite phone in my pack and whether I could get a signal from down here to report our position to the surface team. The sleeping quarters led to another room that looked like some kind of laboratory or medical facility. Stainless steel tables, cabinets full of equipment I couldn't identify, and more of those disturbing paintings covering every available wall surface. These paintings were different from the ones we'd seen before, more detailed, more clinical, showing what appeared to be medical procedures being performed on human subjects. The medical facility paintings were clinical in their horror, showing step-by-step procedures that made my stomach turn. They depicted what appeared to be Soviet researchers conducting experiments on local subjects, indigenous people who looked terrified and confused in the early panels, then progressively more changed and wrong as the sequence continued. "These look like some kind of experiment records," Rebecca said, studying the images while her environmental equipment continued its steady clicking. "Look at how they're arranged chronologically, like a medical journal in visual form." She was right. The painting showed a clear progression. Initial contact with local populations, medical examinations, injections of some unknown substance, and then transformations that became increasingly disturbing. The subjects in the later paintings barely looked human anymore. "This is seriously messed up," I said, taking photographs with my digital camera. The images would be crucial evidence if we needed to report this to authorities, though I wasn't sure which authorities would even have jurisdiction over a 30-year-old Soviet facility. Whatever they were doing here, it wasn't legitimate research. Rebecca had moved to examine some of the medical equipment, her flashlight revealing instruments that looked more like torture devices than scientific apparatus. "Some of this equipment, I've never seen anything like it. It's not in any medical textbook I know." Before we could explore further, Dmitri's voice echoed through the facility, carried by the acoustics of the underground chambers. "Everyone back to central room. We found something important." Rebecca and I exchanged concerned glances. The urgency in Dmitri's voice suggested they'd discovered something significant, possibly something that would finally explain what this place really was. We hurried back to the main chamber, where Dmitri and Luella were waiting with Walt. The machine continued its soft humming, and I noticed the organic growth on the floor seemed to have spread slightly in just the short time we'd been exploring. It now covered a wider area around the machine's base, extending in thin tendrils toward where we stood. Dmitri held what looked like an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and its binding cracked from decades in the underground environment. "Where did you find that?" Walt asked, reaching for it with the eagerness of someone who'd spent too many corporate meetings explaining disappointing quarterly results. "In what looked like the commander's office," Dmitri explained in his accented English. "There were several journals and files, but this one seemed most complete. Has detailed records from 1963 to 1965. Walt opened the journal carefully, mindful of its fragile condition. "These are research notes," he said, flipping through pages covered in neat Cyrillic handwriting. "Detailed entries about experiments and observations." "What does it say?" Luella asked, peering over Walt's shoulder while continuing to document everything with her camera. Her earlier enthusiasm had been replaced by growing unease as the true nature of the facility became clear. Walt handed the journal to Dmitri. "Your Russian's better than mine. See what you can make of the technical details." Dmitri took the journal and began reading, his expression growing darker with each entry. Finally, he looked up and began translating key passages. March 12, 1964. Moscow has sent additional equipment for the experiments. Dr. Volkov believes we are close to breakthrough in biological integration project. The subjects from local population have shown remarkable adaptability to the stimulus, though side effects remain problematic. He flipped forward several pages and continued. June 23, 1964. 3 more subjects lost today. The old shaman warned us again that we have awakened something under the ice, and that it will consume us all if we continue. The men laugh at his superstitions, but I am no longer certain he is wrong. The growth continues to spread despite our containment efforts. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. The growth they were referring to was clearly the same organic substance we were seeing now, which meant it had been active and spreading for over 30 years. "There's more," Dmitri said, his voice grim as he turned to the final entries. November 5, 1964. Communication with Moscow has been lost for 2 weeks now. The growth has reached the upper levels. Volkov has locked himself in the machine room, claiming he can control it. The remaining staff and I will attempt to seal the facility tomorrow and reach the surface. If anyone finds this record, do not, under any circumstances, reactivate the machine. The final entry was written in increasingly shaky handwriting, as if the author was struggling to maintain composure. November 6th, too late. It's in the walls now, in the air. God help us for what we've done here. The machine cannot be stopped. It has become part of something larger. A heavy silence fell over our group as Dmitri closed the journal. The machine's humming suddenly seemed louder, more ominous, as if it was responding to our discovery of its history. I looked down at the floor and noticed with alarm that the organic growth had spread further while we'd been listening, creeping closer to where we stood. "We need to get out of here," I said, my 22 years of experience in dangerous industrial environments finally overriding my scientific curiosity. Now. But even as I said it, I could see Walt calculating, weighing the corporate implications of walking away from what could be the biggest discovery of his career against the obvious dangers we were facing. In his mind, I could almost see him imagining the boardroom presentation, the stock price surge, the promotion that would secure his financial future after the divorce. "Not yet," he said, and I realized we were in serious trouble. I stared at the journal in Dmitri's hands, the final desperate entry still echoing in my mind. The silence in the chamber felt heavy, oppressive, broken only by the steady humming of the machine and the soft clicking of Rebecca's environmental equipment. I glanced up at my colleagues' faces. All of them looked as disturbed as I felt, except for Walt, whose expression had taken on a calculating quality that made me deeply uncomfortable. "We need to contact base," I said, breaking the silence. "This is way beyond our drilling parameters. This is a biohazard situation that requires specialized response teams." Walt nodded slowly, but I could see him thinking, weighing corporate considerations against safety protocols. "You're right. We should report this immediately to Houston and let them decide how to proceed." I handed the journal back to Dmitri and pulled out my satellite phone from my pack. Standard procedure required us to check in with the eye. Drilling operation every 12 hours anyway, and we were already overdue. The phone was one of those new Motorola units that cost more than a mid-range car, but in situations like this, the expense seemed justified. I extended the antenna and waited for it to acquire a signal. The LED display showed it was searching, but after several minutes, nothing appeared. No signal bars, no satellite connection, just a steady, no service message blinking on the small screen. Something's wrong with the phone, I said, looking up at the others. I can't get a signal. Luella stepped forward, adjusting her equipment bag. Let me try. Sometimes these units need specific positioning for optimal satellite acquisition. I passed her the phone, and she walked around the chamber, holding it at different angles and elevations. She tried adjusting the antenna length, checking the battery indicator, and even attempting to manually select different satellite networks. Her expression grew increasingly concerned with each failed attempt. It's not the phone, she finally said, her voice tight with worry. Something's actively blocking the signal. I'm getting interference patterns that suggest deliberate jamming. Rebecca moved closer, her environmental monitoring equipment beeping more rapidly. Could be electromagnetic interference from the machine, she suggested, gesturing toward the humming apparatus in the center of the chamber. Or maybe there's some kind of shielding built into this facility. Whatever it is, I said, fighting down a growing sense of unease. We need to get back to base and report this through proper channels. We're not equipped to handle whatever this situation represents. I gestured toward the journal and the strange machine, trying to keep my voice steady and professional, despite the implications of what we'd discovered. Walt stood up, his decision made. Pack everything up. We're leaving now. As we gathered our equipment, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The organic growth I'd spotted earlier around the machine's base had spread noticeably across the floor in just the short time we'd been standing there discussing our findings. Thin tendrils were creeping outward in all directions, extending several feet farther than before, moving slowly but visibly toward where we stood. Guys, I said, pointing at the spreading growth. That stuff is moving. Everyone turned to look. Dmitri cursed under his breath in Serbian, a string of words I didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear from his tone. We need to go, Luella said, already backing toward the corridor that led to the surface. Right now. That's when it happened. The machine in the center of the room suddenly changed its rhythm. The soft humming became louder, more insistent. Dials that had been twitching slowly began spinning rapidly. Lights that had been blinking in steady patterns started flashing erratically. A high-pitched sound cut through the air, starting, low but quickly rising to a painful whine that made us all clap our hands over our ears. What the hell? I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the noise. The pain was immediate and intense, like someone driving heated needles into my eardrums. I saw Rebecca drop to her knees, her face contorted in agony, her expensive environmental monitoring equipment scattering across the floor. Luella was trying to help her while covering one of her own ears with her free hand. Dmitri had backed all the way to the doorway, his stocky frame pressed against the wall as he fought against the overwhelming sound. Walt stood frozen in the center of it all, staring at the machine with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between horror and fascination, as if he was seeing the solution to all his corporate problems and his worst nightmare simultaneously. Walt, I screamed, grabbing his arm through the painful din. We have to go. The sound snapped him out of whatever trance he'd been in. He nodded and turned toward the exit, but I could see something had changed in his eyes. A gleam of obsessive interest that reminded me of the way he'd talked about quarterly projections and market share during our worst budget meetings. We all stumbled toward the corridor, the sound growing more unbearable with each second. The organic growth seemed to be pulsing in rhythm with the machine's new frequency, spreading faster now, sending out tendrils like fingers reaching for our boots as we fled. Behind us, the machine's whine rose to a crescendo that felt like it was tearing something fundamental in the air itself. We ran through the corridors, the sound pursuing us like something alive and hungry. My head felt like it was going to explode, and I could taste blood in my mouth from the pressure on my eardrums. Rebecca stumbled beside me, blood trickling from her left ear as Luella half carried her up the spiral staircase. Dmitri led the way, taking the stairs 2 at a time, despite the equipment weighing him down. When we finally reached the hatch, we burst out into the Siberian air, gasping and shaking. The sound was muffled now, but still audible from below, a mechanical shriek that seemed to vibrate through the permafrost itself. Walt and I grabbed the heavy metal door and heaved it shut with desperate strength. Dmitri helped us secure the locking mechanism, twisting it until it clicked into place with a finality that felt like sealing a tomb. What the hell was that? Luella gasped, still supporting Rebecca, who looked pale and disoriented. "I don't know," I said, my ears still ringing painfully. "But we need to get back to base now." We gathered our equipment and climbed onto the snowmobiles. The ride back was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd witnessed. The wind had picked up, blowing snow across the landscape and making visibility poor, but I was grateful for any distance between us and that underground nightmare. By the time we reached drilling site Omega-7, a full storm was brewing. We rushed inside, and I immediately headed for the communication center to report what we'd found and request immediate evacuation. But what I saw when I got there made my heart sink. Our communications equipment, all of it, had been systematically destroyed. The satellite uplink lay in pieces on the floor. The main radio console had been smashed with deliberate precision. Wires were pulled out and scattered like someone had gone methodically through every component. Even our emergency beacon, stored in a locked cabinet, had been damaged beyond repair. "What the hell happened here?" I said, picking up pieces of our expensive satellite equipment. The others crowded into the doorway behind me, their faces reflecting the same shock and growing fear. Walt surveyed the damage with a strange calmness that made me deeply uneasy. "Must have been equipment failure," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Power surge from the generator, maybe." I looked around the room carefully. All the windows were intact. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of the kind of electrical surge that would physically tear equipment apart like this. "This wasn't equipment failure," I said firmly. "Someone did this deliberately." Walt shrugged, but I caught something in his expression, a flicker of guilt that made me wonder exactly how long he'd known about this facility and what corporate had really sent us here to find. Over the next 3 days, our situation deteriorated rapidly. Cut off from the outside world, we rationed our food and fuel while the storm raged outside. Walt became increasingly erratic, obsessing over the facility and insisting we needed to return for more data. Rebecca developed a severe ear infection from whatever had happened down there. Luella grew more paranoid by the day, convinced that something had followed us back from the underground complex. On the 4th morning, I was checking our generator when I heard it, the distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the wind. I ran outside without bothering with my parka and looked up at the gray sky. There it was, a black helicopter with corporate markings, descending toward our landing pad. 4 people in bright orange Arctic gear jumped out before the rotors even stopped spinning. The lead figure pulled off his helmet as I approached. "Dr. Garrison," he called out over the noise. "I'm Captain Rodriguez. We lost contact with your team 4 days ago." "Thank God you came," I said, feeling a relief so overwhelming I nearly collapsed. They took us aboard immediately. As the helicopter lifted off, I watched the drilling site grow smaller below us, and I found myself thinking about that sealed hatch somewhere out there in the white expanse. The debriefing in Houston was exactly what I'd expected. Corporate lawyers, insurance investigators, and safety officials who listened to our story with professional skepticism. The official report listed our experience as equipment failure and adverse weather conditions resulting in temporary communication loss. No mention of the facility, the paintings, or the machine that had nearly driven us insane. Walt received a promotion and a corner office. Luella left the oil industry entirely. Rebecca took early retirement on medical disability. Dmitri transferred to operations in Kazakhstan, as far from Siberia as he could get. I kept my mouth shut and took the corporate settlement they offered. The bonus was enough to pay off the mortgage and cover both kids' college expenses, with enough left over for Luella and me to take a real vacation for the first time in 20 years. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I hear that humming sound in my dreams. I think about that machine still running somewhere beneath the Siberian permafrost, and I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed longer. I never reported what we really found out there. The world has enough problems without adding Soviet bioweapons to the list. Some things are better left buried. But I know it's still down there, waiting. And someday, someone else will find that rusted door and make the same mistake we did. I just hope they're smarter than we were.